When theorising about how to use weapons like these, the shield and this axe, we often forget one very important tool in our toolbox: anthropology. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, very often when we're looking at things like this, we look at European archaeology, we look at experimental archaeology, reenactment essentially, where we make recreations of the objects and we have a go with them, we spar with them and this kind of stuff. And of course we look at HEMA sources, that is the actual treatises or manuals as some people call them, for the fighting systems of Europe. However, they only date from the 14th century onwards, and this is a great big problem when we're looking at Viking or Norman era weapons, or indeed the ancient world like Greece or Egypt or Rome. So when we come into these periods and we've got different weapons, we've got different mindsets, different cultures, religions, languages and geographies, and of course, you know, a big different time period. Very often, the assumptions that we make based on later periods, for example, 15th, 16th century treatises, they might function very, very differently back in the 9th century or the 1st century or the 5th century BC. And of course, some of these places that these people fought, people like Alexander the Great fought all over Asia Minor and all the way to India. And of course, the Egyptians, the Romans and the Greeks fought in what's now the Middle East and North Africa. And so, you know, we're quite separated from the source material, as it were, and the way that they may have used things. So, without beating around the bush, there is another important tool in our toolbox, and that is, as any good archaeologist will tell you, anthropology. That is, looking at the existing or relatively recent documented practices of other people in other parts of the world. It could be looking at Maori fighting systems using various types of club, or it could be looking at spear and shield systems in certain parts of Africa, or indeed South America or Southeast Asia or India. It could go all over the world, and this is a very, I think, underappreciated on channels like mine, element to studying these things. Now, as you know, I am a former archaeologist, and my degree is in archaeology, but I did units in anthropology, and we looked at combat on the Trobriand Islands, for example. They've got very characteristic types of clubs, and looking at this type of tribal warfare, I think is really, really important when we're looking at prehistory, or indeed documented history, where we just don't have a lot of technical details about how people used their weapons. So I'm only going to give one example in this video because I want to keep it pretty concise. That's right, I really am going to keep it concise today. And that is this fantastic video here, which is showing people in North Africa. It says West Africa, but I think it's probably North Africa. And they are Tuaregs. And the Tuareg are known for practicing a fencing system, essentially, with the sword and the shield. Now, they actually have different types of shields. They've also got small shields. But what we can see here are large shields. Now, I have got a smaller shield. This is actually Somalian, but the Tuareg have a similar type. It is essentially boss gripped. The grips have come off it, but they're there, much like an Indian dal. So you hold it in the middle like a large buckler, and this is made of animal hide and is quite thick. And they fence with sticks. Now, I'll come back to that in a second. We actually find similar videos from the Sudan, where we can find groups like the Hausa, for example, and what are commonly known as dervishes, practicing with their type of sword, which is called a cascara, and their type of shield, which again is actually not dissimilar to one of these, but it has more of a noted boss in the centre. And they have their own fencing systems, and they're not all the same. So what we see the Tuareg doing is not necessarily the same. It's got some similarities, some parallels, but it's not the same as what the Beja, for example, are doing in the Sudan. So they do have different tribal fighting systems, different tribal weapons, even to the point that a cascara is different to the Tuareg takuba, and this is a takuba. Now, what you can see in this video is actually people practicing for the use of a large shield, bigger than this one, and in fact we can tell from the French description that the shield is made of antelope hide. Funnily enough, it looks a bit like the cow pattern shields that we see in ancient Greek art, in the really early Greek representations, those large kind of figure 8 shields that we see. Interesting. Is there a connection there? I don't know. I'm not going to postulate. But it's interesting that they practice fencing with these large shields and with a takuba, but instead of using a takuba, they use a stick. Now, this is the first point I want to raise. In HEMA, in a lot of modern martial arts, we tend to use things which look quite sword-like, okay? And we tend to replace, whether it's spears, swords, axes, whatever, we want the weapon to look like the real weapon, which is a little bit of a reenactorism, because when we look at actual tribal cultures who literally, I mean, this is from the 1920s, that video, they were still fighting like that with those weapons. You know, and they had been for hundreds of years. And what did they practice with? A stick, because it's a safe replacement. And this was used also in medieval Europe. The Romans, of course, used wooden sticks for practicing with. And we know they were used in the Viking period as well. And later on, they were known as wasters, wooden swords, or just a stick, just a good old common garden ash or willow stick with a bit of flex in it. It will hurt, but it won't break bones. It won't injure. It will just give a nasty welt, much like the traditional British single stick or the French la canne. So this is very much a traditional thing. So taking your shield, I'll just grab the Norman shield because it's here. And this undoubtedly was one of the most common ways of practicing, was with your shield, and not doing too much damage with it. Obviously, you're not just smashing your friend in the face with it, and practicing with your stick and your shield. And this was fundamentally how most people learned swordsmanship. They didn't go to a swordsmanship school. They didn't use Federschwert or blunt swords. They just used a stick. Right. So that's the first thing we can take away from it. But the second thing is, if we look at these videos, and it's amazing these videos exist because, of course, film came along just in time to capture some of this stuff, we can see recognizable techniques. So one of the things about a large shield is it covers you high and low and from side to side. So it's very difficult to get around the shield. Now, when we spar with shields, inevitably you find the two main targets you find yourself going for are the head and the leg, so high and low. You can't get around the sides very easily unless you're thrusting around with a spear or a gladius or whatever, but you need to be close in to do that. But generally speaking, if you're standing out at fencing distance, as we see these guys, then you are often going high and low. And here we can actually see recognizable techniques. They're trying to get over, like a Scheitelhau essentially in German longsword, over the top of the shield, but they're very often coming down at the lower leg, down at the ankle. We also find archaeological in Europe backup kind of support for this being very common with shield fighting, both at Visby but also at Stamford Bridge, where there's a lot of wounds to the legs. Obviously, if you're using a large round shield or even a kite shield, then the legs are one of the things you can get at. And we can see recognizable techniques in here where sometimes you'll see the person pretend to go high, and in one case we can see, I think, what's probably a double feint, pretend to go high, pretend to go low, and then do a symbolic hit to the person's head to show that you could have got them in the head. And they're not actually hitting each other because they're just playing around, they're just having some fun, they're just training. Obviously, if they were training in a bit more earnest or have a competition, or someone had a bit of a grudge match or trying to prove a point, they'd probably lay their hits on and they'd cause some blood, but they wouldn't kill each other, because ultimately they are a group, they are a tribe, a nation. They are there to get better at fighting their enemies, not to kill each other, hopefully. So I'm going to wrap it up there. And small, simple video, really to say we can learn a lot from anthropology, both written accounts, artistic accounts. There's some very good ones of those we might look at in future videos. But this beautiful resource of filmed early 20th century examples of tribal martial arts practice is a real goldmine of information. And we really should sometimes, when we're looking at ancient and medieval weapons, refer a little bit more to this type of anthropological resource, because it's really, really good stuff. And it reminds us of some simple things about how great a stick is as a practice weapon, and also basically how playing and sports are often the foundation of martial arts and actually enable the practice of it safely without hurting each other. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope I see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.